Lay down a list of what is wrong, things you told them all along. Pray to God he hears you, and pray to God he hears you. And where did I go wrong? I lost a friend somewhere along in the bitterness.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Backfired, an NBA history podcast about bad teams, bad luck, and bad decisions. My name is Lewis, and today I'm going to talk about the first few times that a 1 seed or a 2 seed has been upset in the first round of the NBA playoffs since the year 1984. So in total, this has happened 11 times, and I'm going to talk about the first 3 times today and break this into 3 parts that I'll post a few weeks apart. This is a very interesting topic to me, but if I tried to squeeze it all into one, I either wouldn't be able to go into as much detail as I'd like, or this would be like a 3-hour-long episode, and that's a lot for you and for me both. So I'm going to do 3 of the upsets today, 4 in like 2 to 3 weeks, and then the last 4 in a couple weeks more. But before I get into those 3 playoff series, I was inspired to put to paper something that I've been aware of for a while. I think this is really interesting, and I wonder if there are other franchises that have such similarities like these two do. But the Vancouver/Memphis Grizzlies and the Minnesota Timberwolves, who right now, of course, are linked together in our minds by their wild playoff series this past year, which was endlessly frustrating to watch most of the time. But if you are an American listening to this, you've probably seen either a graphic online or like you've been told about this in school. I was told about this in middle school, actually, but there are some eerie similarities between President Lincoln and President Kennedy that are completely coincidental, and some of the often cited claims are not true at all. But they're supposed to mean like, oh, these 2 guys are linked together in some mysterious way. Some examples of these coincidences are that Lincoln and Kennedy both have 7 letters, which is boring. Both were elected to Congress in 46 and elected president in 60, of course, 100 years apart. Both presidents were shot in the head on a Friday. Their assassins were born in 39. Both assassins were themselves killed before trial. Both presidents were succeeded by a President Johnson, who was born in 08. One of the false ones that's repeated a lot is that Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy and that Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. But I wanted to create one of those myself for the spooky similarities between the Grizzlies and the Timberwolves. That sound you hear is Wolves fans across the nation shutting off the pod right now because I said spooky. But in the early goings in Vancouver, the Grizzlies were really heavily following the playbook of the Timberwolves to their detriment, even though their president and general manager, Stu Jackson, Stu Anon, gave a puff piece interview to the Vancouver papers shortly before he resigned, where he pulled out a bunch of Utah Jazz media guides and said that that was the path that the Grizzlies were actually following. The Grizzlies and the Wolves have, similar winning percentages. They're 2 of the 3 worst franchises historically. The Wolves have a 39.9% winning percentage and the Grizzlies 42.9%. The team in between them is the Los Angeles Clippers. The Wolves began play in 1989 and the Grizzlies did so in 1995. These are not always going to be exact, but, this is really just all for fun. Minnesota and Vancouver each have 9 letters. The Grizzlies played their first home game against the Timberwolves, which is a buzzer beater win for the Grizzlies. The Timberwolves made the playoffs for the first time in their 8th season, and the Grizzlies did so in their 9th. Similarly, the Timberwolves' first playoff series victory was in their 15th season, while the Grizzlies was in their 16th. Here's where it really gets interesting, though. They've each had a relocation scare that would have taken them to a city that used to have the NBA that lies along the Mississippi River. The Wolves had theirs after their 5th season, which would have taken them to New Orleans, and the Grizzlies had theirs after their 4th season, which would have taken them to St. Louis. They each drafted what I'll call their first fake franchise player, somebody who scored a ton of points but did not take them to the playoffs, with the 3rd pick. And it was somebody who played at least some power forward for both teams, Christian Laettner for the Wolves and Sharif Abdur-Rahim for the Grizzlies. Both Laettner and Abdur-Rahim were traded from the franchise that drafted them to the Atlanta Hawks, where they became one-time All-Stars in the first full season that they played in Atlanta. The Wolves and the Grizzlies both drafted their first true franchise player in their 7th drafts. These were also power forwards. For the Wolves, that was Kevin Garnett, and for the Grizzlies, that was Pau Gasol. Garnett and Gasol were each traded during the 2007-08 league year to rival historically great franchises in the Celtics and the Lakers. Garnett and Gasol played each other in the finals twice in 2008 and 2009, and each won a championship against the other. Each team has had Sidney Lowe as their head coach. Each team has made exactly one conference finals. Each team fired their head coach after losing in the Western Conference Finals, although Minnesota's Flip Saunders did get another half season. Those fired coaches, Saunders and Lionel Hollins, have each been the head coach of that team more than once and were first appointed mid-season. They've each had a long streak of playoff appearances. The Wolves went 8 seasons in a row and the Grizzlies for 7 in a row. And then now currently they each have a dynamic and super athletic young guard who is the face of their franchise, Ja Morant and Anthony Edwards. Their theoretical starting power forwards are both stretch bigs, Jaren Jackson Jr. and Karl Anthony Towns. Cat, of course, is a better shooter, of course, but both stretch the floor. Both Cat and Jaren Jackson are really centers, but play power forward alongside a defense-first, non-shooting big who gets a lot of screen assists, who played for a very long time for a small market perennial playoff team. Okay, so since this is getting very tenuous, I'm gonna stop early. But thank you for indulging me on that one. That was fun. I'm gonna polish that one up a bit actually, and probably make either a YouTube video or TikTok out of that. But in the meantime, I'm gonna get into the meat and potatoes of the episode, which is the first 3 big playoff upsets of a 1 or 2 seed since 1984. And the reason that I'm picking 1984 is not just an arbitrary pick. 1984 was the first year that the NBA playoffs were made up of the top 8 teams from each conference. Now, at the time, that meant that a lot more sub-500 teams were making it in because the league only had 23 teams. So, for example, think about the playoffs where Michael Jordan was just coming off of a broken foot, 1986. The Bulls made the playoffs that year with a 30-52 record. Now, Jordan had only played 18 games that season. If they'd had him for the entire season, of course, we would assume that they would have been a better team than that record indicated. But the fact remains, they made the playoffs with 30 wins, which nowadays is completely unimaginable given recent times, especially in the Western Conference, where the 46-win Nuggets or the 48-win Suns missed the playoffs. But with the play-in, of course, there is a shot for example, a 36-win 9 seed to actually make the playoffs like the Pelicans did this past year. But, we're all glad that the Bulls did make the playoffs in 86 because that added to the legend of Michael Jordan. That playoffs had the game 2 where Jordan scored 63 points against the Boston Celtics. Larry Bird delivered the iconic "God disguised as Michael Jordan" quote. But sub-500 teams making the playoffs used to happen all the time. So, for example, the Boston Celtics faced off in the first round against a sub-500 team 5 seasons in a row from 84 to 88. And the Lakers did the same from 84 to 89, so 6 seasons in a row. Obviously, that means that we should put asterisks by every Celtics and Lakers title in the 1980s. Only one of these playoff upsets that we're going to talk about in this little mini-series was a sub-500 team taking down a Goliath. A lot of the teams pulling the upset were in like the 42 to 46 win range, so not that far over 500, but still a proven winning team. So all 3 of these today are 7-2 upsets. So we're going to start with the first one. We're going to go back to the 1987 Western Conference first round, in which a team with a losing record, the 39-43 Seattle SuperSonics, faced off with the 55-win Dallas Mavericks. Now, as I mentioned in episode 4 of this podcast about the Stepien rule and the Cleveland Cavaliers of the early 80s trading away all their first rounders, a lot of those first rounders went to Dallas. And with the Cavs being extremely bad, the Mavericks got a bunch of high draft picks thanks to Cleveland's incompetence. So the Mavs had 4 players on their roster that were from Cleveland, just giving up picks with reckless abandon. So in order of draft year, they were Derek Harper, the starting point guard. Harper was actually one of Atlanta's picks that Cleveland had acquired and later moved to Dallas. Harper was a really good defender. He made second team all defense this year in 1987. He could score pretty well. He's one of 4 players who played for Dallas to have his number retired by the franchise. I make that distinction because not only have they retired Bill Russell's number 6, but also Kobe Bryant's number 24. There's Sam Perkins, the starting power forward. Detlef Schrempf, who has not yet blossomed into the consistent bench scorer that he would later become in Indiana. But this was only his second year in the league, and he was already getting recognized for his uncommon long-range shooting touch for a 6'10 guy by being invited to compete in the three-point shootout at All-Star Weekend, where Of course, he came in second to none other than Mr. Larry Bird. And then finally, Roy Tarpley, who I'll talk about in depth in a future episode. Very interesting and sad career that this guy had, but Tarpley was a monster big man off the bench. And those aren't the only major players in the rotation. There's Rolando Blackman, the leading playoff scorer. He was another guy with a retired jersey. The Mavs got Blackman from Kiki Vandeweghe holding out and forcing a trade to Denver. So if you want to hear more about that, go back to episode 13. Mark Aguirre, the small forward, the leading scorer in the regular season. James Donaldson, who was a walking double-double that year, played 82 games, 37 minutes a night, just an absolute machine at the starting center position. And so all indications were that this was a really good team. They were kind of a glass cannon. They were number 2 in offense and 14th in defense out of 23 teams. So below average on that end. They were coached by Dick Motta, who I mentioned in the Kiki episode, but I failed to mention, which I should have, that Motta also coached the Washington Bullets to a championship back in 1978. So the Mavs have a championship level coach, and they were kind of on a roll. They'd made the playoffs in the last 3 years and made it to the second round twice. Now, Seattle was kind of the opposite. Seattle had not made the playoffs in a couple years. They had been the 5 seed in early March, but then finished the regular season on a 6-13 slide down to 7th place, in part due to their starting center and rim protector Alton Lister breaking his foot with 7 games to go. Seattle was 6th in offense and 16th in defense. One big problem that they had was that they fouled way too much. But on the positive side, they had a really strong, 3.5-man core of players. The half that I'm talking about is Nate McMillan, Atlanta's current head coach. I'm not going to pretend that he was a great player or anything, but he was good. He got a lot of assists. The 3 were Tom Chambers, a power forward. He was the MVP of the All-Star game this year. Xavier McDaniel, a future All-Star at small forward. And then another future All-Star at the shooting guard position, Dale Ellis, who most importantly was a guy who had just been traded to Seattle from Dallas in exchange for Al Wood, who was very ineffective for Dallas and didn't play in the playoffs at all. In 211 games for the Dallas Mavericks, Ellis averaged 8 points and 3 rebounds in 16.5 minutes per game. He only got 7 starts out of those 211 games. In his first season in Seattle, which was this year, he scored a very efficient 25 a night in 37.5 minutes. And he was super motivated to show up against Dallas. He always felt from day one that he was going to get traded. He wasn't getting minutes in Dallas, and he actually welcomed the trade happening because, quote, I would daydream about coming back and having a really good game. I'm looking forward to coming back to Dallas and hopefully making that dream come true. And, of course, I'm not really spoiling anything because you already know that Seattle won this series, but Dale Ellis absolutely went off. So the Sonics lost game 1 by 22 points. It was 151 to 129. When 2 glass cannon, good offense, bad defense teams match up, you get a combined score of 280, apparently. After game 1, the Sonics won 3 straight to win the best of 5 series in 4 games. Ellis's shooting splits in this series are crazy. He went 56, 50, 84, shot 22 times a game, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, 29.5 points per game in total. He just absolutely cut the Mavericks up. He had the game-winning free throws in game 2, 43 points in game 3, instantly got revenge on the team that traded him away, both because of the trade and instantly got back for the blowout loss in game 1. But really, the Sonics had kind of just been playing with house money. Seattle's coach, Bernie Bickerstaff, who had been Mavs coach Dick Motta's assistant with the Bullets, had a bunch of quotes in various newspapers that read the following that he told UPI, quote, everybody's figuring us to lose, so if we do, it's not a big deal. We don't have anything to lose. Dallas is the better team, but we're not going to lay down for them. And after game 1, there were a bunch of Mavs quotes. Derek Harper saying, we're here to get down to business. Lots of triumphant sound bites and then just absolutely falling apart. Now, in game 4, the Mavs were missing their starting center, James Donaldson, thanks to a bone bruise. So that, of course, contributed. But the Sonics just stepped on the Mavs' necks in the fourth quarter of game 4. They were already up by double digits going into the fourth, but they outscored them by 15 more in the fourth quarter. And this catastrophic loss for the Mavericks was put simply by Dick Motta. They just looked past the Sonics, especially after the resounding game 1 victory. They had assumed that they'd won the series, and they were already looking ahead to Portland or to Houston. And the shock of losing game 2 at the very end on a Dale Ellis free throw just absolutely sent them into a tailspin. So to set the scene for this, with 4 seconds left, it's tied game. The Mavericks are trying to inbound the ball. Derek Harper shuffles his feet while he's trying to throw the ball in. That's a travel. The Sonics got the ball. Ellis drew a foul and sank the game-winning free throws with 2 seconds left. And after the season, Mavs coach Dick Motta actually hit the job market and had some exploratory conversations with the Knicks and with the Clippers. And he actually told the New York Times that he didn't know if he could win a championship in Dallas. Quote, "I think I've taken this team as far as I can take it." He also made some comments that he didn't have a dominant center, which of course annoyed their center, James Donaldson. He was not a dominant center, but he was good enough that the team had just inked him to a 5-year extension in March of that year. So certainly he had every reason to believe that he was a big part of the team moving forward and not going to be supplanted by somebody else. But eventually Coach Motta just stepped down and took a short break from the game. And after 2.5 seasons off, he returned to the sidelines in Sacramento. The SuperSonics then actually advanced to the Western Conference Finals after they defeated the reigning Western Conference champion Houston Rockets in 6 games. The Rockets had a young Hakeem Olajuwon, still going by Akeem at the time, and Ralph Sampson in the front court. And then, to nobody's surprise, the Sonics' Cinderella run ended when they were swept in the conference finals by the eventual champions, the Los Angeles Lakers. So now let's move on to 1989, when the Golden State Warriors defeated the mighty Utah Jazz in the first round. So this season, the Warriors had 43 wins, while the Jazz had 51. So this is the early days of the Stockton and Malone pairing in Utah, but they're bolstered by Defensive Player of the Year Mark Eaton, who earned his first and only All-Star appearance this year. He averaged 6 points, 10 rebounds, and almost 4 blocks per game. Mark Eaton, by the way, is really fascinating to me, so I'm going to talk about him for a little bit. He became this outstanding NBA player, multiple-time Defensive Player of the Year, one of the best shot blockers of all time. At his peak in 1985, he averaged 5.6 blocks per game, which, of course, is the most in NBA history. That is incredible. But when he was growing up, he really wasn't that motivated to play basketball. He mostly wanted to play water polo. And although he was 6'11" in his senior year of high school, he was so uncoordinated that he was the backup center on his high school basketball team. So after graduating high school in 1975, he went to tech school and worked as a mechanic for a couple of years. After working at a garage for a little while, a chemistry professor who was also an assistant basketball coach at Cypress College, which is a community college outside of LA, saw him and told him that he needed to at least try out for the Cypress College team. So Eaton played 2 years at Cypress, and he was actually drafted in the 5th round of the 1979 NBA draft after his first season at Cypress. But he stayed in college for all 4 years, eventually playing at UCLA. But at UCLA, he got barely any playing time at all, only 6.5 minutes per game across 2 seasons. So really, he did not have that much basketball experience at all when he was drafted in the 3rd round of the 82 draft by the Utah Jazz. But as head coach Frank Layden said, you can't teach height, and by that point, Eaton was 7'4". Now, Eaton said that he'd had a mindset change after a conversation that he had with Wilt Chamberlain at a pickup game, where Eaton was just trying to force things on offense and keep up with guards on defense, really just had no idea how to maximize his physical gifts and his skill set. So Wilt pulled him aside, and as Eaton recounts, he said, quote, "You are never going to catch that guy," like pointing at a guard. "You're never going to catch that guy. And more importantly, that's not your job." Then he positions Eaton in front of the basket and he says, "Your job is to stand here and block shots. Your job is to stop the other players from getting to the basket, collect the rebound, and then throw it up to the guard. Let them go down on the other end and score it. And then your job is to kind of just cruise up to half court and see what's going on." And to quote Eaton, that little 5-minute conversation turned into a 12-year career. So Eaton, who originally just dreamed of getting a couple of NBA contracts and touring around the country, he was now the anchor of the #1 defense in the league. But while they were elite on the defensive end, the Jazz were not really that great offensively, despite having Karl Malone, who poured in an efficient 29 a night, and John Stockton, who averaged 13.5 assists. Those three, Stockton, Malone, and Eaton, were the team's best players, but they also had sixth man Thurl Bailey, who started and played 40 minutes a game in this series that we're talking about, Bob Hansen, a shooting guard, and then former #2 pick out of Louisville, Darrell Griffith, who is another shooting guard. And that was about it. Those were really the only guys who played major minutes in the playoffs. They were extremely top-heavy, and with the exception of Eaton, who played 33 minutes per game in the playoffs, every other starter played over 40 minutes per game. And Stockton and Malone actually played over 45 each. So outside of the short rotation, when you look under the hood at their regular season 4 factors, a couple of things really stick out to me. So as a team, they turned the ball over a ton. They were 22nd out of 25 teams in turnover percentage. Stockton averaged a career high 3.8 turnovers per game, not on a horrible percentage, but his backup, Jim Less, was just stinking up the place, though. He had a 35% turnover percentage in his 9.5 minutes per game, which is absolutely horrendous. And second of all, for the time, they were extremely slow. They were 22nd in pace out of 25. They played at 98 possessions per game, which would have been middle of the pack in 2022, but at the time it was well below their opponent, the Golden State Warriors, who flew down the court at a rate of 107.3 possessions per game, which literally has not been topped since 1989, except for one time, which was the 1991 Denver Nuggets. Other than those Nuggets, every other NBA team for the past 33 years, these Warriors are faster than them. So for comparison, the 7 seconds or less Suns, who were first in pace in 2006, ran at just under 96 possessions per game, which was slower than the Jazz in 1989, who were near the bottom of the league. So the NBA used to be lightning fast. But so it's very interesting that this Jazz team, who, has its flaws, but is loaded with talent, lost to the Warriors, who were middle of the pack at just about everything. They were 14th in offense, 12th in defense. They were below league average at getting to the line on offense, above league average at opponent effective field goal percentage. So, okay on defense. But every other four-factor or advanced stat was basically like 9th to 17th, somewhere in that range. So really just hovering around league average in almost everything. But the one thing that made them stick out was their pace. They completely overwhelmed their opponents by turning every single game into a track meet and emphasizing offensive rebounding over defensive rebounding. And their personnel lent itself to that. Like the Seattle SuperSonics in the last series, the Warriors had great young talent, but this young core that they were building was much better than these Sonics guys were. Those were like 1-2-time All-Stars, but the Warriors had future All-Star Mitch Richmond at shooting guard and first-time All-Star Chris Mullin at small forward. So those two guys are Hall of Famers, and the team around them was constructed really well. So they had a solid point guard in Winston Garland, who's Darius Garland's dad. They had Larry Smith and Rod Higgins in the front court. Both of them were power forwards, and so that lent to the Warriors playing smaller and more mobile. They had Terry Teagle as a reserve swingman. And if they needed size, there was Manute Bol coming off the bench, who had just averaged 4.3 blocks in the regular season in just 22 minutes per game. Also shot 37% from the field because he was absolutely launching threes. He did shoot 2 for 12 from 3 in this 3-game series. And yeah, you heard that right. This upstart Warriors team absolutely wiped the floor with this perennial playoff team in Utah. And it really just came down to the Warriors getting hot at the right time. But yeah, the Warriors swept the Jazz. In Game 1, the Warriors shot 49% from the floor as a whole. Chris Mullin and Mitch Richmond combined to score 71 points on 51 shots, just insane efficiency. And really just instantly got in the Jazz's heads because they were supposed to be the best defensive team, but it was the Warriors defense that came through that night, holding Karl Malone to just 22 points, allowing John Stockton to get whatever he wanted, and holding Thurl Bailey and Darrell Griffith to a combined 16 of 40 shooting, which is not good. The final score of Game 1 was 123 to 119, which was uncomfortably high for Utah. And the 4-point margin doesn't really tell the whole story because Utah had tried to come back, and every time they came close, the Warriors just hit a crushing shot. Now, Game 2, the Jazz really had an opportunity. They had the game completely under control with 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter. So they'd slowed it down to an unimaginable 89.5 pace. The Warriors only got 81 shots off in the entire game. In the regular season, they'd averaged 97 shots a game. So the Jazz just completely mucked it up. But close to the end, with about 5:20 remaining and the Warriors down 80 to 79, they scored 14 unanswered points to take the lead and just demoralize the Jazz. 2 threes from Rod Higgins, and then 2 baskets, 2 free throws, and another dunk, 8 straight points from Terry Teagle to leave Utah winless at home and down 0-2 to a team that they absolutely should have beaten. Thanks to Sports Odds History, which is a resource that I just found out about today, they're super useful. They don't have the last series, but they have this series. Thanks to them, I know that the Jazz were favored to win this series heavily. It was minus 1,000. So this was a massive, massive upset in the making as the Warriors held Karl Malone scoreless in the fourth quarter and overall held the Jazz to under 40% from the floor in Game 2. And then going into game 3, Warriors head coach Don Nelson, who is one of the greatest ever to do it. He's the guy that Greg Popovich just overtook for most wins as a head coach, by the way. He said that he thought that his players were, feeling a little tight, and he was worried with it being the first game at home in those playoffs, and Mitch Richmond was going to be receiving the Rookie of the Year trophy that night. He was worried that the Jazz would just catch them sleepwalking. But Chris Mullin did not let that happen. 7 seconds into the game, he scored the first basket for the Warriors and then stole the inbounds pass and scored again. So 10 seconds in, the Warriors were up 4, and he was super energized, and the team followed his lead. And this time they beat the Jazz by double digits. Everybody not named Stockton or Malone on the Jazz combined for 39 points on a combined 16 of 50 shooting, which is disgusting. And the Jazz, who were really hoping for a matchup with the Detroit Pistons in the finals, were sent home with a really bad taste in their mouths. Mark Eaton had only mustered 2 blocks in 3 games, where Manute Bol had swatted 18 shots in fewer minutes. The Warriors, not relying on a dominant big man and instead leaning on Mullin and Richmond, who were jump shooters, really helped them out there. And there was some shooting luck, to be sure, but the Jazz really fell apart mentally at the end of games, so they took a big lick there. This was also the season that Jerry Sloan took over midseason for Frank Layden. So there were some growing pains there, but after that, they continued a long run of playoff appearances. They went to the playoffs 20 years in a row, which is absolute insanity, from 84 to 2003. Maybe this could have been their year, but the transitive property tells me that is not the case, because the Warriors got their ass absolutely handed to them in the second round by the Phoenix Suns 4-1, including a 27-point loss and a 36-point loss. Then the Suns got swept by the Lakers, and then the Lakers got swept in the finals by the Pistons. So, as I said, by the transitive property, I think actually the Jazz were the worst team in the playoffs that year. But I really don't want to take anything away from the Warriors here, because 2 years later, they did it again. Mullin and Richmond were further unlocked by the addition of Tim Hardaway, the Hall of Fame point guard, and that short-lived trio was known as Run TMC, short for Tim, Mitch, and Chris. They combined for 72.5 points per game in the league's second fastest offense. They slowed it down by 4 possessions per game from their mark 2 years before, only 103.6 possessions per game. But Run TMC was super fun. You got to watch some highlights of theirs. Hardaway would run the break, and then it would just be Mullin and Richmond passing to each other or pulling up. Both guys were really good shooters, of course, excellent cutters. Just a really solid unit of guys who always knew where the other two were at all times. I do believe that LeBron and Dwayne Wade probably watched a ton of Run TMC fast breaks for inspiration when they were together on the Heat. No doubt in my mind about that one. And this Warriors team was kind of similar to the 89 Warriors in that they didn't place much emphasis on the center position, at least in the first round. It was all just pushing to the basket or pulling up every time, just run and gun all day. Jim Peterson and Alton Lister started for the Warriors, but Lister only played 5 minutes in the entire series, and Peterson only played 45 across the 4 games. So really, big men just weren't the emphasis. It was all Run TMC. There was also Šarūnas Marčiulionis, who was a Hall of Famer from Lithuania. He's the guy who really introduced the Euro step into the NBA. And alongside Arvydas Sabonis, he won the gold medal at the 1988 Olympics in Seoul for the Soviet Union. He played 7 seasons in the NBA, and most of them were in Golden State. There was Mario Elie, who's just a dog, just the kind of guy who can do just about anything on the court and will do whatever it takes to win. Of course, now he's a 3-time champion because of that mindset. Rod Higgins, again, from the 89 team. So there's some different personnel on the 91 team. They kind of had a different goal of what they wanted to accomplish on the court. They were a bad rebounding team, not a good defensive team on the whole. They fouled a lot, but they drew fouls at a prolific rate, and they shot a ton of threes. They made a good percentage of those threes for that era, a bit under 34%, which at the time was 6th in the league, if you can believe it. So they were all about pushing the ball in transition, shooting threes, drawing fouls, and as a result, they were super exciting to watch. Now, on the other side, there were the San Antonio Spurs, who were anchored by a dominant force in David Robinson. And as we all know, this guy was absolutely ridiculous. This was only his 2nd season in the league after serving in the Navy, and he's just the perfect 90s big man. His stats this season were 25.5 points, 13 rebounds, 4 blocks a game. He hit his free throws. I think about David Robinson a lot because I think he's like the ideal center. That's not like a value to, I'm not saying that he's the greatest center of all time. I also just hate ranking players. It's not interesting to me at all, but he's undeniably talented. Over time, he became a better distributor. He averaged almost 5 assists at his peak. He welcomed Tim Duncan with open arms and willingly passed the torch to Tim, even though Robinson was the MVP and the Defensive Player of the Year and all that. He just wanted to win, and he was willing to give up touches to do so. Let's appreciate David Robinson. Shaq, Kareem, Hakeem, Patrick Ewing, all those guys have their perks too, but Robinson's awesome. And the Admiral was not the only good player on the Spurs this year. So the rest of their starting lineup was Rod Strickland, a slightly taller point guard for the time, 6'3". For a point guard now, that's a normal height. But I remember when he was on Portland in '96, it stuck out to me because they were a very tall starting lineup, at least on opening night. I know they had 2 small forwards. They had Chris Dudley, and then at the 5, they had Arvydas Sabonis. So anyway, tall lineups are fun to me. Willie Anderson, who's a very versatile swingman at the 2. They had a young Sean Elliott, who outside of one odd season in Detroit, he was a lifelong Spur. Terry Cummings, who had been an all-star when he was on the Bucks. He's at the power forward. And then veteran swingman scorer Paul Pressey coming off the bench. So all these guys had scoring prowess, but like the '89 Jazz, these Spurs were the number 1 defense in the league, but they were also middle of the pack offensively. Their head coach was the genius Larry Brown. If you listen to the John Barry episode, you'll remember that he came to San Antonio immediately after winning the 1988 NCAA championship at Kansas. Brown was as much of a flight risk as there probably ever has been in the coaching ranks. He just can't stay in one place for too long, but he is a very good coach. So the series began and San Antonio took game 1. Willie Anderson scored a career high 38 points. Robinson and Strickland each poured in 30 apiece. But David Robinson got in a couple of dust-ups in this game. One, literally a minute into the game, where Robinson knocked Alton Lister down, and Lister got up and gave the Admiral a hard foul, got called for a flagrant. And then with about a minute left in that first quarter, Robinson got tangled up with Jim Peterson fighting for a rebound, and Peterson just kind of threw Robinson to the floor. And Coach Don Nelson, or Nelly as they called him, he said that Robinson was the instigator both times, and that's fine, but Robinson should have also been punished instead of just the Warriors players getting dinged for it. So the Spurs took game 1, and that was fine. They were favored in that series, of course. They had 55 wins while the Warriors had 44. But those small encounters kind of motivated the Warriors a little bit. And then a similar thing happened in this series to the Warriors and Jazz series. In game 2, the Warriors won in a 17-0 run in the middle of the third quarter where 4 different guys scored, and the Spurs were completely thrown off by that. Coach Nelson's proclivity for playing small also helped. It was just hard in this series for the Spurs being, a bigger, slower team to keep up with Run TMC. Chris Mullin also had a personal 10-0 run in that game, and the Warriors, stop me if this sounds familiar, but the Warriors just had so many guys who could go off at a moment's notice that it was impossible for a Spurs team with their best player being a center to keep up. And you especially saw that in game 3 when the Warriors just absolutely could not miss. Mullin, Richmond, Hardaway, and Marshallonis were all just on fire this game. Everybody had over 20 points. The team as a whole shot 44 for 77, which is a blistering 57%, 5 of 9 from 3 as well. And then in game 4, it all came down to the 3 ball. Both teams shot well, all things considered, 48% for the Spurs and 51% for the Warriors. But the Warriors, and especially Tim Hardaway, placed an emphasis on shooting threes, and they made 5 while the Spurs made 0. And that wound up basically being the difference, 13 points. Now, you'd think that these last 2 series we talked about would mean that the Warriors were a rising power in the West, that Run TMC was going to power them to the conference finals and maybe a championship or 2. Well, the Warriors then lost in the next round to the Lakers. And then before the next season, they traded Mitch Richmond to Sacramento. And then they made the playoffs 2 out of the next 3 seasons after that, lost in the first round both times. After that, made the playoffs 1 single time in the next 18 seasons. So a rising power in the West, they were not. Run TMC was a very fun 2 years, but that was all it was. Now, the one time that the Warriors made the playoffs in the next 18 seasons was a very notable team. I'm sure nobody knows what I'm getting at when I say that, but in a few weeks when the episode featuring that series comes out, you will not believe what you're hearing. But anyway, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed talking late 80s and early 90s basketball for a little while, and hope you enjoyed the thing at the beginning, whatever we're going to call that. NBA history can be fun and funny, folks. You wouldn't be listening right now if you didn't think that. But yeah, please follow the socials. At Logic Master with a 0 for the O is my Twitter. At Backfired NBA Pod on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. Getting close to 4,000 on TikTok. So check that out. Also, if you don't mind, please take the time to subscribe on whatever platform it is that you're listening on. You don't have to, but I'd really appreciate it. I keep meticulous track of follower counts and listen counts and all that kind of stuff. And I like when numbers go up. So thank you. Also, special thank you to my Overcast subscribers. I just dropped a pretty penny on ads over there. So glad to see that it's working so far. But I think that'll do it. Next week will not be playoff upsets, but it'll be something else that is very exciting that's been in the work for a couple of weeks about one of the teams that was mentioned today. This time I am 97% sure that the topic next week is actually going to be what I think it is, because it has to be that. I'm making myself stick to the schedule. But yeah, that's all for me. Have a good one.
Baby, are you gonna be the one that saves me? And after all, you're my wonder wall.